impossible to endure. A pace so gentle, so slow, that the passing of a day could be measured not by schedules or screens, but by the movement of shadows on stone walls or the quiet drifting of clouds across a pale blue sky. In this world, people lived in small villages surrounded by forests, fields, and time. Time was everywhere. It hung in the air like mist in the morning and settled softly over the thatched rooftops and cobblestone paths. There were no alarms, no deadlines, no instant anything. Just the sound of roosters, the creak of wooden carts, and the murmured voices of neighbors exchanging the same greetings each morning. Survival in those days was not something dramatic or urgent. It was simply ongoing. People survived because they had to, and the methods they used, the techniques they passed down quietly from grandmother to grandson, were simple, slow, and completely unremarkable. Yet they worked. For example, when the winters were cold, and they often were, people didn't rush to thermostats. Instead, they gathered dried moss from the forest, pressed it into cracks in the wooden walls, and insulated their homes with patience. They wore layers upon layers of coarse wool, and they sat together, close, near a low fire that hardly flickered, fed with twigs, bark, and patience. No one hurried. There was nowhere to go. In the gardens behind their homes, people practiced companion planting without even knowing that was what it would later be called. Beans were planted with corn. Garlic was scattered near roses. They didn't study books or follow influencers for advice. They watched what worked year after year. They noticed quietly. That was their greatest technique. Observation without urgency. During long rains, villagers would listen to the patter on the rooftops. They would mend things by hand. Leather boots that had seen too many miles, woven baskets with frayed edges. Children would carve wooden spoons beside their parents, smoothing each one with stones by the firelight. The spoons were never perfect, but they lasted. Just like the stories, passed along in whispers like, "When the snow is wet and the birds go quiet, the frost will follow in 3 days." They preserved food not in flashy jars or vacuum-sealed bags, but slowly, hanging herbs upside down from wooden beams, pickling onions in brine that smelled faintly of cloves, laying apples in dry straw to keep through the winter. Time was their ingredient, and patience their tool. One forgotten technique involved the placement of sleeping spaces. In small cottages, the bed was not placed by the wall, but sometimes right in the middle, to catch the last of the day's warmth from the fire and the least of the night's cold from the walls. Beds were layered with straw mattresses, topped with woolen blankets, and sometimes, in colder regions, dried leaves sewn into sacks for extra padding. They drank teas made from weeds, nettles, yarrow, dandelion, not for taste, but because someone, sometime, had noticed they helped. They didn't understand why, and they didn't care. Things didn't need to be understood to be trusted. Lanterns were filled with fat, not oil. They were dim and smoky. Light was scarce and precious. Most people slept when the sky went dark and rose when it turned light again. There was no midnight scrolling, no late-night distractions. Just silence and the distant howls of foxes or the hoot of an owl if one was awake enough to hear it. There was a technique used for keeping warm that involved heated stones. Smooth river stones, warmed in the hearth, wrapped in cloth, and placed at the foot of the bed. No wires, no batteries, no noise. Just a rock, and heat, and time. Laundry was done by soaking garments in ash water, lye made from wood ash and rainwater. It smelled of nothing in particular. They scrubbed slowly, often humming tunes with no lyrics, passed down from no one in particular. In times of sickness, survival meant lying still. Blankets, herbs, rest. Often they believed more in what not to do than in what to do. Don't eat when you're feverish. Don't speak to those who have seen a ghost. Don't plant on a day when the moon is wrong. Some people built their homes low, half buried in the earth to guard against the wind. Others dug small cold pits beneath their floors to keep milk from spoiling. Everything had a place, and every place had a reason. Even travel was a kind of survival technique. You didn't travel fast because to travel fast meant you might miss something important, like a change in the weather, or the sound of a fox den nearby, or the shimmer of dew on a patch of mint growing wild. Horses were not always used. Sometimes people just walked. Slowly, quietly, step by step. There was a tool called a spindle used to spin thread. People would sit for hours, turning wool into yarn, yarn into cloth, cloth into something to wear or trade. It was a technique, yes, but also a rhythm. Spin, twist, loop, spin, twist, loop. The kind of repetition that makes eyelids heavy. They had songs for planting and songs for harvesting. Songs for sowing flax and threshing wheat. None were particularly catchy. Most were more like hums. Long, drawn-out notes that slipped into silence like mist into trees. And speaking of trees, forests were not something to rush through. They were watched. If a pine tree bent in a strange way, people would remember it for years. If a squirrel vanished suddenly, they took it as a sign. Even their survival techniques were filled with waiting and watching, not reacting. Rainwater was collected in barrels, filtered through layers of cloth and sand. It took hours, sometimes days. There was no tap to open, no button to push. They stored stories, too, in their own way. They'd carve them into wood, stitch them into quilts, or just whisper them by the fire until everyone had fallen asleep in their chairs. Most weren't even exciting. They were stories of walking to the stream, stories of gathering berries, stories of one winter that was colder than the last. They believed that garlic in your shoes could keep away sickness, that salt at the doorway kept spirits out, that rosemary under your pillow would help you dream. Were these survival techniques? Maybe. But they believed, and so they worked, in the quiet way belief often does. There was no noise, no urgency, no need to know everything at once. And maybe that's the greatest forgotten survival technique of all. The ability to wait, to rest, to breathe, to sleep,